Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into a foundational and often quite surprising text, the biblical book of Numbers from the King James Version.
It's important to understand you're not picking up a straightforward narrative here. Think of the book of Numbers as a detailed record, part census, part divine instruction manual, part legal framework, and part travelogue of the Israelites' time in the wilderness.
Exactly. And our mission in this deep dive is to extract the core insights about this pivotal period. We want to understand how this massive group of people, fresh out of slavery in Egypt, organized themselves, what their foundational beliefs and practices were, and to map their journey. We'll be focusing on a specific time frame, roughly the second year after their exodus, right up to their arrival on the plains of Moab, just on the cusp of entering the Promised Land. Okay, so the book kicks off with a lot of counting, right? Let's unpack this census.
It does, yeah. Very early in that second year after leaving Egypt, while they're in the Sinai wilderness, there's a clear directive to Moses conduct a census. But this wasn't just about, knowing how many people there were.
Right, it was specifically to count all that are able to go forth to war in Israel, so adult males, 20 years and older. What's the significance of that focus right off the bat?
Well, it immediately highlights the practical and potentially precarious situation of this community. They're on the move in uncertain territory, and establishing their military strength is clearly a priority.
Makes sense.
The method of counting is also worth noting. By families and ancestral houses, each man counted individually. This really underscores a deep connection to lineage and tribal identity. And to manage this massive undertaking, a leading man was appointed from each of the 12 tribes to assist Moses and Aaron.
We even get their names quite a roll call. You've got Eliezer from Reuben,
Yeah.
Shelumiel representing Simeon, the well-known Nahshon from Judah,
Right.
and Danelin from Issachar, Eliab from Zebulun, Elishama from Ephraim, representing the Joseph tribes, Gamaliel from Manasseh, Abidan from Benjamin, Ahiezer from Dan, Pagiel from Asher, Eliezer from Gad, and finally, Ahira from Naphtali. So these weren't just random guys picked off the street.
Precisely. No, these 12 are described as renowned of the congregation and princes of the tribes, respected leaders crucial for this large-scale enumeration. And the resulting numbers for each tribe are remarkably specific, suggesting a very organized process.
They are indeed. Reuben numbered 46,500, Simeon a substantial 59,300, Gad at 45,650, and Judah leading with a strong 74,600.
Quite a force there for Judah.
Then we see Issachar with 54,400, Zebulun at 57,400, Ephraim with 40,500, Manasseh at 32,200, Benjamin at 35,400, Dan a considerable of 62,700, Asher at 41,500, and Naphtali at 53,400. What does this level of granular detail tell us?
It reinforces that sense of meticulous organization, but also hints at the importance of knowing their resources, particularly their potential fighting force. When you tally those figures, you get a total of 603,550 men fit for military service.
Wow.
However, there's a key exception. The tribe of Levi was intentionally excluded from this military count. Why do you think that was?
Good question. Well, the text clarifies that the Levites had a very different non-military role. They were appointed over the Tabernacle of Testimony.
Which was their portable sanctuary.
Exactly, their portable sanctuary, the central place of worship, and God's presence among them and all its contents. So their service was spiritual, not martial.
Exactly. Their responsibilities were diverse, carrying the tabernacle during their travels, ministering within it, and crucially, setting up camp around it. This leads us directly into the highly structured organization of the entire Israelite camp.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I mean, imagine this vast multitude on the move. The layout is random. Each tribe had a specific place to pitch their tents, identified by their own standard or banner.
A tribal flag almost.
Yeah, almost like a tribal flag marked with the ensign of their father's house. And everyone was to be far off about the tabernacle of the congregation, emphasizing the central importance of their faith.
Right. And the cardinal directions dictated these tribal groupings. On the east, the leading tribe was Judah, under the standard of Judah, accompanied by Issachar and Zebulun. Nahshon was the overall captain of this eastern division. What might this leadership placement signify?
Well, perhaps a recognition of Judah's prominence, a theme we see echoed later in Scripture.
Could be.
Then, to the south was the standard of Reuben, with Simeon and Gad alongside them, under the leadership of Eliezer. The west saw Ephraim's standard, with Manasseh and Benjamin next to them, led by Elishama. And finally on the north, it was Dan's standard, completed by Asher and Naphtali, with Ahiezer as their captain. So a very deliberate arrangement.
Absolutely. And the text even provides the total numbers for each of these divisional camps, highlighting the sheer scale of this organized movement. But the key takeaway here is the central position of the Levites and the Tabernacle within this vast array.
Right.
It visually and spatially reinforced the primacy of their religious life and the constant presence of the divine in their midst.
Following this initial layout, the narrative shifts to the specific duties of the Levites. We get the genealogy of Aaron's sons, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. But then there's that sobering note about Nadab and Abihu dying for offering strange fire before the Lord. It sounds like a serious breach of protocol.
It really underscores the immense respect and adherence to divine instruction that was expected, especially when dealing with the sacred. The Levites, as a whole, were appointed to assist Aaron and his sons in the service of the tabernacle to keep the charge of it.
But there were very clear boundaries they couldn't cross.
Yeah.
Right? They were not to come near the sacred vessels and the altar on pain of death. This really emphasizes the hierarchical structure within their religious system and the absolute sanctity of certain roles and objects.
Definitely. Subsequently, another census is conducted, this time specifically of the Levites, from a month old and upward, totaling 22,000. And we see a further division of labor among them into three main families: the Gershonites, the Kohathites, and the Merarites, each with distinct responsibilities. It's like a highly organized logistics team for the portable sanctuary.
Okay, let's look at their roles. The Gershonites were responsible for bearing the curtains and coverings of the tabernacle, the hangings of the court, and all the associated ropes and service instruments, all under the supervision of Ithamar, Aaron's son. So the fabric and softer elements, basically.
Exactly. The Kohathites had the profound responsibility for the most holy things, the Ark of the Covenant itself, the table for the shewbread, the golden candlestick, and the altars. Critically, these items were to be carried on their shoulders.
On their shoulders.
Highlighting their sacred nature and the direct physical involvement of these Levites in their transport. A specific count of the Kohathites aged 30 to 50, those fit for this carrying duty, numbered 2,750 men. Why this emphasis on carrying?
Well, it suggests a level of reverence, doesn't it? A direct human interaction with the holiest objects, rather than just, carting them around. And then we have the Merarites.
Right. The Merarites were in charge of the more structural components. The boards that formed the tabernacle walls, the bars that held them together, the pillars, the sockets they rested on, the vessels of the court, and all the pins and cords of the outer area.
The heavy lifting, essentially.
You could say that. Their census within the 30 to 50 age range was 3,200, while the total number of Merarite males from a month old and up was 6,200. It's fascinating how every single element of the tabernacle's care and transportation was meticulously assigned.
It truly is. And it's reiterated that all of this Levite service was to be performed under the direct authority of Aaron and his sons, further cementing their leadership in all matters concerning the sanctuary.
Moving beyond just the physical organization, the Book of Numbers also lays down crucial principles for maintaining holiness within the camp. This included the removal of anyone deemed unclean, those with skin diseases like leprosy, individuals with bodily discharges, and those who had come into contact with the dead. They were to be put outside the camp.
So, maintaining purity.
Exactly. These weren't just hygiene rules. They reflected a profound understanding of ritual purity and the need to maintain a holy space in the presence of the divine.
That makes sense in the context of their beliefs. We also see instructions regarding confession and making amends for sin.
Yes, if someone committed a trespass against the Lord, they were required to confess their specific sin, repay the full amount that was taken or damaged, and add an additional fifth of that value to the wronged party.
A fifth part extra.
Right. And if the wronged party had no close relatives, this restitution was to be given to the priest.
Then we encounter what's called the law of jealousy, a very specific and somewhat unusual procedure for a man who suspected his wife of infidelity. It involved bringing her to the priest for a ritual and a particular offering. It gives you a glimpse into the social dynamics and concerns of the time.
Absolutely. And the law of the Nazirite outlines a voluntary path of consecration. Individuals could set themselves apart to the Lord for a specific period through certain abstentions. They had to avoid wine and strong drink, let their hair grow uncut, and abstain from contact with the dead, even close family members.
But a very dedicated vow.
Very. At the completion of their Nazirite vow, specific offerings were required. It's a fascinating look at personal devotion within the community.
Following these guidelines, we have the beautiful priestly blessing, the very words Aaron and his sons were instructed to use to bless the children of Israel. The Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face shine upon thee, and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee, and give thee peace.
Such powerful words, a blessing that still resonates today.
Indeed. Moving forward, we see acts of dedication and the provision of offerings. When the tabernacle was first set up, the leaders of Israel brought a significant offering, 6 covered wagons and 12 oxen. How were these distributed, and what does that tell us?
Well, these weren't just given out randomly. They were specifically allocated to the Levite families based on their service needs. The Gershonites received 2 wagons and 4 oxen.
For the curtains and coverings.
Right. The Merarites received 4 wagons and 8 oxen.
For the boards and pillars.
While the Kohathites received none of the wagons or oxen because their service required them to carry the holy items on their shoulders. It's a very practical allocation of resources based on the specific tasks at hand.
It makes perfect sense when you put it that way.
Exactly. We also have the instruction regarding Aaron's responsibility for lighting the lamps of the golden candlestick, ensuring its continuous illumination within the tabernacle. And then there's a detailed ritual described for the cleansing and dedication of the Levites themselves.
This was quite a process, wasn't it? Involving the sprinkling of a purifying water, the shaving of their entire body, washing their clothes, and the presentation of specific bullock offerings, one for sin and another as a burnt offering. The children of Israel were to lay their hands on the Levites, who were then presented as a wave offering to the Lord. What's the significance of this wave offering?
It symbolized the presentation of the Levites to the Lord almost as if they were being offered on behalf of the entire community, specifically in place of the firstborn sons, as previously established. It was a clear act of setting them apart for sacred service.
Okay. Chapter 9 shifts back to the annual observance of the Passover, which they were commanded to keep in the wilderness of Sinai in the 2nd year after their departure from Egypt.
Right, the foundational event.
Interestingly, a provision was made for individuals who were unable to participate at the designated time due to ritual impurity or being on a long journey. They were allowed to observe it a month later. It shows a balance between divine command and, well, practical realities.
That's a good point. And a powerful symbol of God's constant guidance is reintroduced. The cloud that covered the tabernacle during the day and appeared as fire during the night.
The divine GPS, essentially.
You could say that. When this cloud lifted, the Israelites knew it was time to journey. Wherever it settled, they knew it was their place to encamp, all at the commandment of the Lord. This visible manifestation of divine leading must have been an incredibly reassuring and directing force for them.
You'd think so. But as we know, even with divine guidance, the journey wasn't always smooth sailing. Chapters 11 and 12 recount instances of the people's grumbling and complaining.
Again.
Which initially resulted in a fiery judgment until Moses interceded on their behalf. Then we have the well-known episode of their intense craving for meat, vividly recalling the variety of food they enjoy back in Egypt and expressing their dissatisfaction with the manna. It seems like human nature in any era.
Indeed. Moses, feeling utterly burdened by the sheer number of people and their constant negativity, even questions how he could possibly provide meat for such a multitude. This leads to a significant development in their leadership structure. The appointment of 70 elders to share the responsibility of governing the people.
Ah, yes. The Lord commanded Moses to gather 70 respected elders, and the spirit that was upon Moses was also placed upon them, enabling them to prophesy.
And it's fascinating that 2 of these elders, Eldad and Medad, prophesied within the camp itself without going to the designated place. When Joshua suggested Moses stop them, Moses famously replied, "Would God that all the Lord's people were prophets." What does that reveal about Moses' leadership style?
It shows a real humility, doesn't it? And a desire for the spiritual empowerment of the entire community, even if it meant sharing some of his unique authority. It's a remarkable sentiment.
It really is. Following this, the Lord does provide an abundance of quail, but a severe plague strikes the people while they're still consuming it, a stark reminder of the consequences of their ingratitude and disobedience. Such a pattern.
Then we see a challenge to Moses' leadership from within his own family. Miriam and Aaron speak against him because of his marriage to an Ethiopian woman and question his exclusive prophetic authority.
The Lord's response is immediate and unequivocal, isn't it? Affirming Moses' unique relationship with him and the directness of their communication. Miriam is then struck with leprosy as a consequence of her challenge.
Right. Only after 7 days of being excluded from the camp and Moses' subsequent intercession is she healed and allowed to return. It's a powerful illustration of the seriousness of challenging divinely appointed leadership.
The narrative then takes a crucial turn as we reach the pivotal moment of sending spies into Canaan. One respected leader from each of the 12 tribes was selected for this important reconnaissance mission. These 12 individuals were Shemua, representing Reuben, Shaphat from Simeon, the faithful Caleb from Judah, Igal from Issachar, Oshea from Ephraim.
Who Moses renamed Joshua. Right, whom Moses famously renamed Joshua, signifying the Lord saves. Palti from Benjamin, Gadiel from Zebulun, Gadi from Manasseh, Amiel from Dan, Sather from Asher, Nabi from Naphtali, and Gul from Gad. They were given very specific instructions.
Yes, to assess the land itself, whether it was good or bad, fertile or barren, the nature of its inhabitants, were they strong or weak, few or many, and the characteristics of their cities, were they just encampments or fortified strongholds, and they were to bring back samples of the land's produce.
After an extensive 40-day reconnaissance, they returned, bringing back tangible evidence of the land's fertility, most notably a massive cluster of grapes so large it had to be carried by 2 men.
Incredible image.
But their overall report, however, was deeply divided. While they confirmed that the land indeed flowed with milk and honey, they also emphasized the strength of its inhabitants, the formidable nature of their heavily fortified cities, and ominously mentioned seeing the fearsome children of Anak, the giants.
Right, the intimidating figures. In stark contrast to the majority, Caleb and Joshua are offered a positive and faith-filled assessment. They urged the people not to rebel, assuring them that the inhabitants would be easily overcome bread for them, as they put it, and that the Lord was with them.
But their encouraging words were largely drowned out by the fear and doubt instilled by the other 10 spies, weren't they?
Tragically, yes. The reaction from the congregation was one of utter despair and rebellion. They wept openly, murmured against Moses and Aaron, and even voiced a desire to have died back in Egypt or in the wilderness. They went so far as to suggest appointing a new leader to take them back to Egypt.
Unbelievable. And they even threatened to stone Caleb and Joshua for their optimistic report. This profound lack of faith in the face of God's promises provokes severe divine judgment.
Extremely severe. The Lord threatened to completely destroy the current generation and raise up a new nation through Moses. However, Moses, in yet another display of remarkable leadership and compassion, interceded once again, appealing to God's steadfast love and mercy.
And the Lord relented from immediate annihilation but declared a devastating consequence. None of those 20 years old and upward who had participated in the murmuring would ever see the Promised Land.
Except Caleb and Joshua.
With the crucial exceptions of Caleb and Joshua, the 2 who had shown faith.
Their fate was sealed. Their bodies would perish in the wilderness, and their children would endure a 40-year period of wandering as a consequence of their parents' unbelief. In a particularly tragic end, the 10 spies who had spread the negative and fear-inducing report died instantly by a plague.
Wow.
And despite this severe and immediate judgment, some still presumptuously attempted to advance into the hill country against Moses' explicit warning and were soundly defeated by the Amalekites and Canaanites. It highlights the danger of acting without divine guidance and after clear disobedience.
Chapter 15 provides further detailed laws and ordinances, specifically concerning the offerings that were to be made once they finally entered the Promised Land. These instructions covered a variety of sacrifices, burnt offerings, and peace offerings, and specified the exact amounts of flour, oil, and wine that were to accompany different animal offerings.
And importantly, these ordinances were to apply equally to both native-born Israelites and any foreigners living among them. It speaks to the inclusiveness of these future practices.
That's interesting.
We also see the establishment of the heave offering of dough. Once they settled in the land and began to harvest their grain and bake bread, they were commanded to offer a portion of their first baked bread to the Lord as a heave offering. The act of heaving or lifting it up symbolized its dedication.
Okay.
Instructions were also given for seeking atonement for unintentional sins, whether committed by the entire congregation or by an individual, outlining specific animal sacrifices required for these situations.
A sharp contrast is drawn with the concept of presumptuous sin, though, right? Those deliberate and defiant acts of disobedience that openly reproached the Lord.
Exactly. The consequence for such intentional rebellion was severe. Those individuals were to be cut off from the community.
Wow. The chapter also recounts a specific incident of a man found gathering sticks on the Sabbath, a clear violation of the commanded day of rest. Upon the Lord's explicit command, he was taken outside the camp and stoned to death by the entire congregation. It underscores the seriousness of Sabbath observance.
It certainly does. Finally, chapter 15 concludes with the commandment to make fringes on the edges of their garments, with a distinctive blue thread woven into them. What was the purpose of these fringes?
They served as a constant visual reminder, didn't they, of all the Lord's commandments, prompting them to remember and obey, and to avoid following their own desires and inclinations that might lead them astray. It was a tangible way to keep the law present in their daily lives.
A very practical reminder. Then we encounter the dramatic and pivotal rebellion led by Korah in chapter 16. Korah, a Levite with significant standing, along with Dathan and Abiram from the tribe of Reuben, a certain On, also a Reubenite, and a staggering 250 other prominent leaders of the assembly rose up in direct opposition to Moses and Aaron.
And their central accusation was that Moses and Aaron had overstepped their authority, taken too much power for themselves. It was a fundamental challenge to their leadership.
It really was. Moses, in response, proposed a very direct and public test. He challenged Korah and his followers, along with Aaron, to each take their censers, fill them with fire and incense, and present them before the Lord. The outcome would clearly reveal whom the Lord truly considered holy and had chosen for leadership.
But Dathan and Abiram refused to even appear when Moses summoned them, didn't they? They accused him of leading them out of a prosperous land into the wilderness to die and of trying to exert tyrannical rule over them. Their defiance was blatant.
Completely defiant. The Lord's judgment in this situation was immediate, powerful, and frankly, terrifying. The very glory of the Lord appeared to the entire congregation, and God threatened to consume them all. It was only through the desperate intercession of Moses and Aaron, pleading for the sake of the innocent, that the Lord's wrath was momentarily stayed. What then happened to the leaders of the rebellion?
Well, the ground itself dramatically intervened. The earth opened up and swallowed Korah, his entire household, and all his possessions, and they descended alive into the pit.
Unbelievable.
Simultaneously, a consuming fire erupted directly from the Lord and incinerated the 250 men who had dared to offer incense in defiance of the established order. It was a clear and unmistakable divine judgment against their rebellion.
Tragically, the story doesn't end there. The very next day, despite witnessing this cataclysmic event, the remaining members of the congregation once again murmured against Moses and Aaron,
Still murmuring.
incredibly blaming them for the deaths. This renewed defiance resulted in another devastating plague breaking out. It swept through the camp, claiming the lives of 14,700 people before Aaron, at Moses' instruction, took his censer, offered incense as an act of atonement, and stood between the living and the dead, finally stopping the plague.
It just highlights the deeply ingrained skepticism and disobedience within the community, doesn't it?
It really does. To definitively settle the question of Aaron's divinely appointed priesthood and quell further challenges, chapter 17 recounts the miraculous event of Aaron's budding rod. Following the plague, the Lord commanded Moses to take a staff from each of the 12 tribal leaders, with Aaron's name inscribed on the rod representing the tribe of Levi, and to place them all inside the tabernacle. The promise was clear. The rod of the man whom the Lord had chosen would miraculously sprout.
A visual, undeniable sign.
Exactly. And indeed, the very next day when Moses entered the tabernacle, Aaron's rod was the only one that had undergone an extraordinary transformation. It had not only budded, but had also sprouted full-blown blossoms and even produced ripe almonds, unequivocally confirming God's choice of Aaron and his lineage for the priesthood.
Amazing.
This miraculous rod was then ordered to be kept inside the ark as a permanent token against the rebels, to serve as a lasting warning and to prevent future murmurings against the established religious authority.
Chapter 18 then lays out the specific responsibilities and the provisions made for both the priests and the Levites. Aaron and his sons were given the primary responsibility for the sanctuary and their priestly duties, bearing any consequences or iniquity associated with these sacred roles.
And the Levites were designated as their assistants, but were strictly prohibited from approaching the holy vessels or the altar, lest they face death. The lines of responsibility and authority were clearly defined.
Okay, so how were they provided for?
Well, the priests were provided for through specific portions of the offerings brought by the people, the heave offerings, the wave offerings, the sin offerings, and the trespass offerings, which they and their families were permitted to eat in the most holy place. They also received the choicest parts of the oil, wine, and grain, as well as the first ripe fruits of the harvest.
Right.
Importantly, Aaron and his descendants were to have no territorial inheritance within the land of Israel. The Lord himself was declared to be their inheritance and their provision. This reinforced their total dedication to their sacred duties.
Okay, so no land for the priests. What about the Levites?
In turn, the Levites were given the entirety of the tithes collected from the people of Israel as their inheritance, in recognition of their service in maintaining the tabernacle and assisting the priests. However, they too were required to offer a heave offering of the tithe, a tenth of the tithe they received, to the Lord, symbolizing that all blessings ultimately came from him.
Ah, interesting.
And just like the priests, the Levites were not to receive a specific land inheritance among the other Israelite tribes, ensuring their focus remained on their religious service.
Got it. Chapter 20 brings us to another critical point in their journey: the arrival at Kadesh and the subsequent lack of water. This immediately led to the familiar pattern of the congregation gathering in protest against Moses and Aaron,
Here we go again.
lamenting their fate and wishing they had perished alongside their brethren who had died in previous judgments. It seems their faith was constantly tested by the harsh realities of the wilderness.
It really was. In response to this latest crisis, the Lord commanded Moses to take his rod and, in the presence of the people, to speak to a specific rock, promising that it would yield water. However, in a moment of what seems like frustration, or perhaps a lapse in faith, Moses struck the rock twice with his rod.
Didn't just speak to it.
No, and water did indeed gush forth abundantly, providing for the parched congregation and their livestock. This place was named the Waters of Meribah, meaning strife or contention, reflecting the circumstances.
But tragically, this act of disobedience, this failure to fully believe the Lord and to sanctify him in the eyes of the people by simply speaking to the rock as commanded, had severe and lasting consequences for both Moses and Aaron, didn't it?
It did. The Lord declared that because of this, they would not be the ones to lead the congregation into the long-promised land of Canaan. It's a sobering reminder of the accountability of leadership, even for those as close to God as Moses.
Wow. The chapter also briefly recounts Edom's refusal to grant the Israelites passage through their territory, forcing them to take a long detour around their land, adding to the difficulties of their journey.
Right.
And then comes the sad account of Aaron's death on Mount Hor. The Lord commanded Moses to take Aaron and his son Eleazar up to the mountain. There, Aaron was stripped of his priestly garments, which were then placed on Eleazar, signifying the transfer of the high priesthood.
A symbolic handover.
Aaron died on Mount Hor at the age of 123, and the people mourned his passing for a full 30 days, a testament to his importance as their spiritual leader.
As their journey continued in chapter 21, they faced further challenges, including a battle and a vow leading to the naming of a place Hormah. But their difficulties weren't just external. Once again, the people became discouraged due to the arduous journey around Edom and resorted to complaining against both God and Moses.
Focusing on their lack of satisfying food and water and expressing their utter loathing for the manna, their divinely provided sustenance. It highlights the constant tension between God's provision and their human desires.
It really does. As a consequence of their repeated and bitter complaints, the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people. These venomous snakes bit them, and tragically many died. This severe judgment finally brought the people to repentance. They came to Moses, confessing their sin and asking him to intercede with the Lord to remove the serpents. What was the Lord's response to their plea?
Well, the Lord instructed Moses to fashion a serpent out of bronze and to set it on a tall pole. He promised that anyone who had been bitten and then looked upon the bronze serpent would be healed and live.
A powerful symbol. This iconic image serves as a powerful symbol of looking to God for salvation and healing in times of affliction.
Following this dramatic episode, the Israelites continued their onward journey, and the chapter recounts further encounters and significant victories over Sihon, the king of the Amorites, and Og, the king of Bashan.
Crucial victories. These victories were crucial as they began to take possession of the lands east of the Jordan River, marking significant progress towards their ultimate destination.
Chapters 22 through 24 present a fascinating and somewhat unexpected interlude in the narrative. The story of Balak, the king of Moab, and Balaam, a diviner he hires to curse the approaching Israelite nation.
Right. Balak, witnessing Israel's recent victories over the Amorites, was understandably terrified and sought supernatural means to protect his own kingdom.
Balak sent numerous delegations laden with promises of rich rewards to persuade Balaam to come and pronounce a curse upon Israel. Initially, God explicitly told Balaam not to go with him and certainly not to curse Israel, as they were a blessed people.
But Balak persisted, sending even more distinguished officials and offering even greater honors. What was Balaam's response then?
After this second, more insistent request, God permitted Balaam to go, but with a very strict condition. He was only to speak the words that God himself put in his mouth. This sets the stage for one of the most unusual and memorable episodes in the entire Old Testament, the incident of Balaam's talking donkey.
Ah, yes, the talking donkey. As Balaam was traveling to meet with Balak, the angel of the Lord stood in his path, an invisible obstacle to Balaam, but clearly visible to his donkey.
Only the donkey could see the angel.
Right, who veered off the road 3 times in an attempt to avoid the divine messenger. Each time Balaam, oblivious to the angel's presence, became angry and beat his donkey. What happened next is truly extraordinary.
The Lord opened the mouth of the donkey, and she spoke to Balaam, questioning his harsh treatment and pointing out her years of faithful service. This remarkable event forces Balaam to confront the reality that there is more to this situation than he perceives.
It's only then that the Lord opens Balaam's eyes, and he sees the angel standing with a drawn sword, ready to oppose him.
And despite Balak's repeated attempts and the elaborate sacrifices he offered, hoping to influence Balaam's divinations, Balaam, constrained by the divine command, found himself utterly unable to curse Israel.
Couldn't do it.
Instead, to Balak's great frustration and anger, Balaam pronounced a series of powerful blessings upon Israel, prophesying their future greatness, their strength, and their ultimate triumph over their enemies. These pronouncements are a powerful testament to God's unwavering favor and protection over his people, regardless of their own shortcomings.
Chapter 25 takes a darker turn, detailing a significant and grievous sin committed by the Israelites while they were encamped at Shittim. They engaged in whoredom with the daughters of Moab and, more seriously, participated in the idolatrous worship of Baal-peor, a Moabite deity. This blatant apostasy provoked the Lord's intense anger and judgment.
A devastating plague broke out among the people as a direct consequence of this sin. The Lord commanded Moses to publicly execute the leaders who had led the people astray. In a dramatic and decisive act of zeal, Phinehas, who was the grandson of Aaron, killed an Israelite man and a Midianitish woman who were openly engaged in a brazen act of sin within the sight of the entire camp.
A very zealous act. This decisive action, though severe, was credited with stopping the raging plague, but not before a staggering 24,000 people had perished. It underscores the seriousness with which God viewed their idolatry.
And as a direct result of Phinehas' zealous action in defense of God's holiness, the Lord made a special covenant of peace and the promise of an everlasting priesthood with him and his descendants.
That's right. Following this tragic episode and the end of the plague, the Lord commanded Moses and Eleazar to conduct a second census of the entire congregation, counting all men 20 years old and upward who were able to go to war. This second count took place on the plains of Moab, near the Jordan River and across from Jericho, as they stood poised to enter the Promised Land.
This second census, while showing some variations in the numbers of individual tribes, resulted in a total of 601,730 men fit for military service, a slight decrease from the first census taken decades earlier in the Sinai wilderness. The Levites were again counted separately, numbering 23,000 males from a month old and upward, showing a numerical increase in their tribe. What's particularly striking about this second census?
Well, the text explicitly points out a profound and sobering reality. Among all those who were numbered in this second census, virtually none remained of those who had been counted in the first census in the wilderness of Sinai.
Almost the entire generation gone.
With the sole exceptions of Caleb and Joshua. This grim statistic served as a stark and tragic fulfillment of the Lord's judgment upon the generation that had rebelled and refused to believe in his promise of the Promised Land. Their journey, for most of them, had ended in the wilderness.
Chapter 27 turns our attention to issues of inheritance. We encountered the daughters of Zelophehad, who came forward to Moses with a compelling petition. Their father had died without any sons, and they sought to inherit his portion of land, ensuring that their family name would not die out within their tribe. It raises important questions about societal norms and justice.
It does. And the Lord heard their case and ruled in their favor, establishing a new legal precedent. He decreed that if a man died without leaving a son, his inheritance should indeed pass to his daughters. Furthermore, he outlined a clear order of inheritance if there were no daughters either. It should then pass to his brothers, and if no brothers, then to his father's brothers, and finally to the nearest male relative within his clan. This ensured the continuity of land ownership within families.
That's a significant ruling. Within this chapter, we also had the poignant moment where the Lord instructs Moses to ascend Mount Abarim, granting him a final panoramic view of the Promised Land that he himself would not enter.
Such a bittersweet moment.
Following this, Moses, knowing his time was drawing to a close, asked the Lord to appoint a new leader for the congregation, one who would guide them into and through their inheritance. Who did the Lord choose as Moses' successor?
The Lord chose Joshua, the son of Nun, the same Joshua who had shown such faith and courage as one of the spies. Moses was commanded to publicly lay his hands upon Joshua, to invest him with authority before Eleazar the priest and the entire congregation, and to bestow some of his own honor upon him, signifying the transfer of leadership.
Passing the mantle.
Exactly. Joshua was to lead the people according to the guidance of Eleazar, who would inquire of the Lord through the Urim, a means of divine consultation.
Chapters 28 through 30 provide further detailed instructions concerning the various offerings that were to be made to the Lord, establishing a regular rhythm of worship. This includes the daily burnt offerings, specific offerings for the Sabbath day, and elaborate instructions for the offerings required during the appointed feasts: Passover, the Feast of Weeks, Pentecost, the Feast of Trumpets, Rosh Hashanah, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, and the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot.
Yeah, these chapters specify the exact types and quantities of animals, grain, oil, and wine that were to be offered on each of these occasions, demonstrating the meticulousness of their ritual practices.
We also find the detailed law of vows in these chapters, outlining the legal framework surrounding promises made to the Lord. It specifies the binding nature of vows made by men and women, and includes important provisions regarding a husband's right to annul certain vows made by his wife, and a father's authority over the vows of his unmarried daughter.
Which reflects the patriarchal social structure of the time and the importance of family authority in such matters.
Chapter 31 recounts the command to avenge Israel against the Midianites for their role in enticing the Israelites to sin at Peor. Moses sent a force of 1,000 men from each of the 12 tribes to wage war against Midian.
And the Israelite army decisively defeated the Midianites, slaying all of their male population, including their 5 kings, and even Balaam, the diviner who had been hired to curse Israel. They took all the women, children, and all the spoils of the cities and settlements. However, Moses became deeply incensed when he learned that the Israelite soldiers had spared the women. Why was he so angry about this?
Well, Moses recognized that these very Midianite women had been instrumental in leading the Israelites into idolatry and sin at Peor, which had resulted in the devastating plague. He feared a repeat of this transgression.
Right.
Consequently, he commanded that all the male children and all the women who had known a man should be put to death, while only the young virgin girls were to be kept alive as part of the spoil.
Harsh measures. Detailed instructions were then given for the purification of the soldiers and all the captured spoils. Following this, the vast amount of plunder was divided equally between the soldiers who had fought in the battle and the rest of the congregation, with a specific tribute being levied for the Lord from both portions.
The narrative then shifts in chapter 32 to address the specific requests of the tribes of Reuben and Gad. Having observed that the lands of Jazer and Gilead east of the Jordan were particularly well suited for their large herds of livestock, they approached Moses with a proposal.
Yeah, they asked that this territory be given to them as their permanent inheritance, and that they not be required to cross the Jordan into Canaan proper. This was a significant request with potential implications for the unity of the tribes.
And Moses initially reacted with considerable disapproval, right?
Mm.
Fearing that their reluctance to cross the Jordan would discourage the other Israelites and undermine their commitment to inheriting the Promised Land, echoing the lack of faith of the previous generation.
Exactly. However, Reuben and Gad offered a compelling compromise. What did they propose?
They proposed to build sheepfolds for their flocks and fortified cities for their families in the Gilead region. Crucially, they pledged to go fully armed at the forefront of the other Israelite tribes, actively participating in the conquest of Canaan until all their brethren had received their inheritance. Only after this was accomplished would they then return to settle permanently in their land east of the Jordan.
A significant pledge. Moses, seeing their commitment to aiding their fellow tribes, agreed to their request, but under very specific conditions. He stipulated that if they indeed went armed before the Lord into battle and the land of Canaan was subdued, then Gilead would be granted to them as their possession.
But
However, if they failed to uphold their promise, they would be required to take their inheritance alongside the other tribes within Canaan itself. Subsequently, Moses allocated the kingdoms of Sihon and Og, the Amorite kings they had defeated, to the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh, who then proceeded to rebuild the cities in that region.
Chapter 33 provides a comprehensive review of the Israelites' journeyings, essentially a detailed itinerary listing the various places where they had encamped from the time of their departure from Egypt all the way to their arrival on the plains of Moab by the Jordan River near Jericho.
It's a long and evocative list, isn't it? Marking the stages of their arduous 40-year sojourn. The chapter also reiterates the account of Aaron's death on Mount Hor in the 40th year after the Exodus.
And importantly, it includes a final emphatic command from the Lord to the Israelites. Upon crossing the Jordan and entering Canaan, they were to drive out all the current inhabitants of the land, utterly destroy all their idols and high places of worship, and take possession of the land, dividing it among themselves by lot according to their tribes. What was the consequence of failing to do this?
The Lord warned them that if they failed to completely dispossess the Canaanites, those remaining would become a constant source of trouble and conflict for them, like splinters in their eyes and thorns in their sides. Ultimately, the Lord declared if they did not obey this command, he would do to them as he had intended to do to the Canaanites. They would face displacement and judgment.
A stark warning. Chapter 34 meticulously defines the boundaries of the promised land of Canaan that would become their inheritance, providing detailed descriptions of its southern, western, northern, and eastern borders, almost like a legal survey.
The chapter also names the specific leaders who are appointed to oversee the division of this land among the tribes. Eleazar the priest and Joshua, along with one designated leader, a prince, from each of the 12 tribes, ensuring a fair and representative distribution.
Chapter 35 addresses the important provision of cities for the Levite tribe from within the inheritance of the other tribes.
Right.
The Lord commanded that a total of 48 cities, along with surrounding pasture lands or suburbs for their livestock and possessions, be allocated to the Levites across the various tribal territories.
Right. This ensured that the Levites, who had no land inheritance of their own, would have places to live and fulfill their religious duties throughout the nation.
This chapter also establishes the concept of cities of refuge.
Yes, the cities of refuge. 6 specifically designated cities strategically located throughout the land, 3 on the east side of the Jordan and 3 in Canaan proper. These cities were to serve as places of sanctuary for anyone who accidentally killed another person unintentionally.
So accidental killing, not murder.
Correct. They could flee to these cities for protection from the avenger of blood, the deceased's close relative who had the right to pursue and execute the unintentional killer. This protection was to last until the time of a judicial trial, and ultimately until the death of the current high priest. What's the underlying principle behind these cities of refuge?
Well, it seems to be about balancing justice and mercy, doesn't it? Distinguishing between intentional murder, which was punishable by death at the hand of the avenger, and unintentional manslaughter, where there was no malicious intent. The cities of refuge provided a means of protection for the latter, preventing a cycle of blood vengeance while still acknowledging the gravity of the loss of life.
That's well put. Specific laws and procedures governing these situations are carefully outlined.
Finally, Chapter 36 revisits the issue of inheritance involving daughters, specifically addressing a concern raised by the heads of the families within the tribe of Gilead, which was part of the half-tribe of Manasseh.
Right. Their worry was that if the daughters of Zelophehad, who had inherited land because they had no brothers, were to marry men from outside their own tribe, their inherited land would eventually be transferred to another tribal territory, diminishing the inheritance of their father's tribe.
A practical concern about keeping land within the tribe. To address this potential issue and preserve the integrity of tribal land ownership, a new and specific law was established. Heiresses who inherited land were henceforth required to marry within their father's tribe.
This was enacted as a permanent statute for all the children of Israel, ensuring that tribal inheritances would remain within their designated boundaries from generation to generation.
So as we reach the end of our deep dive into the Book of Numbers, we've indeed covered a remarkable amount of ground, haven't we?
We certainly have. From the extraordinarily detailed organization of the Israelite community, the specific roles and responsibilities assigned to each group, to the intricate legal and ritual systems that govern their lives, and the accounts of their arduous and often faith-testing journey towards the Promised Land.
What truly stands out for me is the sheer meticulousness of these records. The detailed censuses, the precise descriptions of the Levites' duties, the accounts of both divine provision and severe judgment, and the step-by-step development of their laws and social structures. It all paints a vivid and complex picture of a nation in formation under divine guidance, facing immense challenges, both internal and external.
Absolutely. And for you, our listener seeking concise yet comprehensive knowledge, we hope this deep dive has provided a concentrated understanding of this pivotal period in the ancient narrative, offering insights into the organizational, legal, and spiritual foundations of the Israelite people during their transformative journey.
This exploration really prompts a fascinating question, I think.
Yeah.
What do these incredibly detailed records, seemingly focused on logistics and rules, ultimately tell us about the core priorities and the inherent difficulties faced by any community striving to forge a cohesive identity while undertaking a significant and divinely guided mission?
That's a great question. And how might these ancient stories, with their clear consequences for obedience and disobedience, still offer points for reflection on faith, leadership, and community in our own lives? Perhaps that's a thread worth you continuing to explore in your own thoughts.